Hello and welcome to this podcast series on food authenticity. My name is Will Suter. In this episode, we'll be looking further into issues of authenticity in the North American honey industry with two more great guests. Peter Awram from the Worker Bee Honey Company, the largest apiary in British Columbia, Canada, and Gillian Wade, an expert in consumer class action litigation, who's very active in this area of food authenticity. This was another great conversation with some deep dives into the issues facing honey producers. Gillian and Peter both have some fantastic stories to tell, so I hope you enjoy it. Hi guys, how are you both today?
Great, thank you.
Excellent. Just to start us off, should do some quick introductions. Peter, could you just tell us a bit about who you are, what you do, a bit about your background?
So I'm a second generation beekeeper, and my dad started way back in the 1950s. And I started as a little kid and have been beekeeping quite a bit since then. I did take a break off to go to university and ended up with a PhD in science and some postdoc work. But then I came back to the family business and have been beekeeping pretty heavily since then. And we're now a pretty typical North American operation, which is migratory, does a mixture of pollination and honey production.
Cool. And how about you, Gillian? Do you want to do the same? Just give us an introduction to your work and some of your background.
Absolutely. I am a plaintiff's lawyer in Los Angeles, California, and I have a particular emphasis on consumer fraud class actions. I lead a consumer fraud department at my law firm, and I have done pretty extensive work in food fraud litigation. It has just sort of developed naturally over time. And I'm astonished how often I am misled and deceived about what I'm eating, even though I'm always paying attention to it just as an occupational hazard. So,
yeah, excellent. So how did you kind of come across honey fraud and honey adulteration as an issue through your work originally? And can you talk about how it's become such a big part of what you do?
Absolutely. So, like I said, consumer fraud comes in many different shapes and sizes and forms. And over the years, I've been doing this about 17 years now, almost exclusively plaintiff's side consumer fraud litigation. And there's a lot of fraud in the food industry. That ultimately led me to Professor Michael Roberts, who is the executive director of the Resnick Center for Food Law and Policy at UCLA. And through that affiliation, I'm on the outside advisory board, which is comprised of food industry leaders, really from all different backgrounds. There's even some people on the board who I've sued before. I'm so happy to be a part of that. And through my affiliation with Michael Roberts, he has been looking at this issue for many years about honey fraud. And he actually brought this to my attention. And it's right up my alley because it crosses probably one of the biggest frauds in history that I've ever seen in relation to food. And it hasn't been stopped. So unlike other types of food fraud that sometimes I think in the plaintiff's litigation side end up seeming kind of silly. People sue here in the United States, people sue about all sorts of things, funny stuff. And this is so serious. And the reason I was so drawn to it is because there is a direct correlation between honey fraud and the survival of beekeepers and our food supply. It will all go away. If this continues down the path it's on, we will have nothing to eat. And so that is really what drew me to this in the first place. And that was all from Michael Roberts introducing me to this problem and introducing me to some beekeepers and what they're experiencing. That's how I got here.
Yeah, fascinating. So, Peter, how about from your point of view? Obviously, you've been in the beekeeping industry basically all your life, being in a family business. Could you tell us a bit about how honey fraud has come to be such a big issue? As Gillian said, it's one of the biggest problems in food fraud, and it's not one that's going away. It's not one that's been dealt with. So, can you talk about how it became such a big problem?
It's a complicated issue, and myself included. I'd heard about honey fraud sort of all my life, and I hadn't really looked into it until it came to my attention through Norberto Garcia, He had done a lot of work on looking at how exports had changed throughout time there, and how all of a sudden, I'd say about 12 years ago now, they had really started increasing substantially. But it probably started really actually a bit closer to the turn of the century here, around the 2000s, 2003 mark, where all of a sudden China had started exporting a lot of honey to the US, and it was caught with a lot of antibiotics in it. So they banned this honey because of this antibiotic that was causing problems in people. And what you ended up seeing is all of a sudden China has this huge amount of honey on hand because they're the biggest producer in there. So they were trying to get rid of it. And they started finding methods that allowed them to get around. This transshipping started because of that. All of a sudden, countries that were never producing honey were all of a sudden exporting huge amounts to the US because they were moving it out of China into places like Vietnam or India and getting it into the US that way. And then also they had this contamination problems in it. So they started developing these huge resin filtering factories. And as a result, there were these huge increase in prices in the US, Canada for honey. And there was this incentive to develop these methods. And at the same time, high fructose corn syrup was becoming big in the US as well as that. And the same method for producing high fructose corn syrup also works with rice, because you're basically taking the starch and you don't care where that starch comes from. And all of a sudden, China, they have this big supply of rice, and they could produce this high fructose rice syrup. So they basically had all the ingredients for the fraud to occur. So what you see is around 2008 or something like that, they've been allowed, to develop all these methods that work really well in honey fraud. Because honey is not a complicated food to fake. It's easy. A high fructose syrup resembles honey in a lot of ways. It's just, it doesn't have all the rest of the components that make it up. So this talk by Norberto Garcia came to my attention because I'd heard of honey fraud, but this extent of it was really kind of unbelievable. You look at these graphs, and there is no doubt these countries that were never significant production places in the past, all of a sudden they're ramping it up. Their hive numbers aren't increasing at all, but the amount of exports that's coming out of them, particularly to the US, has just ramped up. And also over this time, what you saw is a degradation of the retail honey on the shelves, particularly in the US. Generally, the US and Canada produce a light-colored honey. Now, if you go onto the shelves, you see something that is much, much darker. It has gone down in color. And that's because of the imports that were being brought in by packers and people in the US to keep their prices down.
So as Gillian was saying, as she's sort of worked in this area and she's spoken to beekeepers, she's seen some of the effect that that's having. What effects have you seen, since, like you said, since maybe 2008 or so, when, the last kind of 10 years, maybe when this has been a big problem? What effect has that had on your actual business?
Well, what you have seen is a dramatic decrease in price. Sort of around 2003, you had a really high price. At around that 2008 to 2010 mark, the price dropped about 2.5 times, at least on the Canadian side of the market. And generally, you've seen a huge fluctuation in price. And it has made beekeeping a really frustrating business because you don't know how much you're going to get for that honey that you're producing. Your costs don't go down. The costs have increased considerably throughout time as there's more and more pressure on that. But we have not seen the prices that were in the early 2000s at all again. And we're talking, almost 20 years later, yet the price has decreased from that point. Costs have probably doubled during the same period. So it has resulted in a considerable decrease in the number of commercial beekeepers in Canada, an aging population. Generally, beekeepers, they're coming to retirement age and they retire, and the business ends at that point. And very few are getting in because the costs to get into beekeeping right now are significant. The returns are not good enough to get bank loans or anything like that. So in general, you're seeing a decrease in the number of beekeepers that are out there.
The reality of the situation, too, is that the beekeepers, it is not economically feasible for them to survive. The price of honey, because of the fake honey that is imported, is all controlled by the packers who are mixing real honey with fake honey. They set the price because no one can compete with these prices. It's fake honey. So you've got beekeepers in the United States sitting on, some of them on millions of pounds of real honey that they cannot sell because the market is flooded with the fake honey. And what the packers do, the beekeepers need the packers to then sell it to the retailers. So the packers are buying less honey and they're buying it for cheap because they're mixing it with the fake stuff. And so the beekeepers cannot survive. We've already seen between 2018 and 2019 from other causes, 40% of the hives in the United States are gone because of colony collapse, which of course is a whole other issue, but it's all related. And so we've got fewer and fewer bees. Bees are dying all over the world. And now we've got beekeepers who are keeping hives. Their production should be up. Normal economics would show that when demand is up, which it is, and supply is down, that prices would go up. And the opposite has happened. And we're selling more honey and consumers are consuming more fake honey than could even possibly produce in the world. And I think what's interesting about this, it's because of the fraud that's really occurring in the United States, because we're buying the honey, the fake honey, and don't know, is that affects the prices in Canada. In Canada, there's an overproduction. Canadians do not consume all of the honey that they make. They have extra and they export it to the United States. And their prices are down too, like Peter was just explaining. It's all because of the fraud that's got its epicenter in the US. And if this the fact that this has gone on for as long as it has is so alarming to me, because everybody knows. And I think one of the more troubling or the most troubling thing about this is that the retailers know. The retailers know, and they would stop buying it, then the packers wouldn't be able to do this to the beekeepers. And so when they're all in this together, the beekeepers don't stand a chance. And they're not going to be able to survive if this continues down this path.
No, what Gillian says there is very true. You have no control over the price as a beekeeper. And generally what you find is that at the end of the season, when beekeepers have huge expenses, is that the buyers come there and they offer you these really low prices. And you're often in this situation where you're forced to either take it so that you can afford to pay off all these expenses you've just incurred, or you're out of luck. They'll walk away. They're often sort of under, they're putting a lot of pressure on the beekeepers to take it because they have this other source of so-called honey that they can grab if you don't accept their price.
You were saying how one of the alarming things is that this has gone on for so long, kind of unchecked. Could you talk about what some of those kind of legal checks might normally be supposed to be? Like what are the things that are supposed to stop fraud happening that haven't worked in this case, and why that is?
Yeah, it's a complicated analysis there. Of course, we have FDA here and USDA. USDA, they don't really have any power to do anything, and they'll point you to the FDA. The FDA does not address food issues just in general unless there's a health safety crisis essentially happening. They don't have the resources and they just don't do it. And historically, they've been notified of the problem. They have the power to detain or reject products when they're imported in. They're not testing the product when it gets here. So there's no checks and balances. And even though FDA has some sort of definition of what honey is supposed to be, there is no enforcement mechanism on the labeling going on, which leads us to private enforcement, which is lawsuits. But those have their limits as well. I wish it wasn't like this, but from my perspective, consumer fraud in the United States is really focused in certain states because there is no federal cause of action for consumer fraud. So what happens is each state in the union has its own consumer protection type statutes or laws. I would say at least half of them have no private right of action, which means a private litigant can't sue, only a government agency can enforce them, and they don't. So then, occasionally they do, but there's not all these crazy plaintiffs lawyers running around that can sue you in certain states. Then you've also got some states have a private right of action, but what they don't have is a mechanism to bring these cases as class actions. So the way the statutes are written, it precludes that from happening for legal reasons that I won't bore you with. But because when we're dealing with products like honey, for example, because the prices are down, the sales are up, retails for between $4 and $10. The average honey price would be in that range. As a consumer, what you can get back as one person would be the difference between what you paid for the product you thought you were getting and what you actually got. And that gets really complicated because a smart defendant will always argue, well, there's some value to what you purchased. It had some honey in it. And then you get into all these issues of how you calculate that. Are all the batches the same? It gets really, really complicated to calculate damages. And obviously, you're not going to do that for one person. With one person, what's your damage? $1.50, right? You end up, no one's going to litigate a case for $1.50. So you've got to bring a case in a state where you've got a private right of action, you've got a high population of sales, and you're able to bring the case as a class. That limits you even more. So now you're looking at 4 or 5 states where this is probably a decent consumer protection case. And then even doing that, has its limits. There's a lot of defenses. There's a lot that you have to prove, and you're still dealing with a low damage point. So are the cases worthwhile? Yes. Are we going to see more of them? There are some filed. Yes, we're going to see more. But is it going to stop the conduct? I don't know. Because this fraud runs deep. It is a deeply rooted problem that has been around for a long time. And a lot of people are making a lot of money perpetuating this fraud. So in order to get this to stop, I think something more serious has to happen. I think it may need to be looked at through a different lens and addressed in a different way, because I'm not sure that a consumer fraud case will be all that successful. People will try. There are some cases pending. But when I do the analysis, when your damages are low and the defense will argue, you've got to prove that every single bottle of honey for that manufacturer is not real. That's what they will argue that you have to show. There are different ways that you can demonstrate that, but it's very expensive to do it. You could end up spending more money, and this has happened to me in other cases before, calculating your damages than that number actually turns out to be. You spend $1 million on a PhD economist to calculate it, and they tell you your damages are $200,000. That makes it tricky to pursue these cases sometimes. So there's a lot of moving parts, I think a lot of factors to consider that are just present in any case like this that make a consumer case tricky. And I'll also say, just from a regulatory standpoint in terms of self-regulation, industry groups, trade groups, the same people that are perpetuating the fraud have also infiltrated all of these groups. So they're sitting on the boards and they're sitting in the rooms with people when they're recommending different forms of testing or suggesting what should be done. Those same people are the ones importing the fake honey who don't want more rigorous testing. And they are controlling all of this. So that's where the problem is.
Well, there's certainly an issue in terms of the beekeepers are basically a pretty tiny industry. Certainly in my case, I don't consider myself to be a huge business or anything, yet I pretty much know a good chunk of the industry in both Canada and the US because there's just not that many of us. So that alone inhibits the ability to kind of fight against this fraud that much. The people that are making money off of that are just that much more powerful. Yet the influence of bees is quite substantial. The whole entire almond industry in the U.S. would disappear if there weren't the bees that are present in the U.S. Basically, the entire population of hives in the U.S. goes to California for almond production. And that's because the number of hives has dropped so dramatically. It's about a third of what it was about 60 years ago, because there is basically no way to make money. And you see it in Canada as well. There should be a population probably 3 times to properly pollinate crops, and it's just not happening because you can't sustain a business very well there. Definitely, you're seeing the testing methods and all those sorts of things are not adequately addressing it. The labeling regulations are ridiculously lax and inappropriate for what we're seeing. It's often not clear where your honey originated from. And there has definitely been a commoditization that favors the people who are bringing in the fake honey, because consumers in general do want to support local, but that is often not clear on the labels or the way things are presented to them. And you're getting mixtures and things like that, which are being passed off as from the country that it's being sold in, either Canadian or US, but it's not actually what's happening there.
Yeah. You mentioned testing methods there, and I happen to know, when I visited your facility last year, you're one of the people that's pioneering using NMR spectroscopy as like as a new sort of improved way of proving where honey's come from and that it is actually honey. Can you talk about how that differs to the kind of tests that are the current sort of standards in the industry, and what kind of resistance have you seen to that new method? And do you think there's a path forward for it, becoming a sort of new standard?
Well, I definitely think that this is pretty much the only way of dealing with this issue. With my scientific background, it was obvious to me that most of these older methods are very limited and they're not that hard to get around. When you're looking at a specific compound, once you know what it is, you can either take it out if it's not supposed to be there, if it's some sort of artifact from adding a syrup or something like that. And that's how the resin columns originated, so that they're using these resin columns to pull things out that shouldn't be in. So that would be things like in rice syrup. I mean, one of the things that can be found in there is arsenic. And that's what's called this SMR. So they work on methods to pull that out so that it's not detectable. The other thing is that they can start putting things in there that need to be there. So that might be proline that people are looking at, or diastase or enzymes like that you're adding in there. The difference is with something like magnetic resonance is that you're looking at the whole thing. It's a bit like a DNA fingerprint here. So you have a whole huge amount of information there. And for somebody to fake that, all of a sudden they have to put in a whole bunch more things because the magnetic resonance is seeing so much more. And with magnetic resonance, you don't even have to know what it is. You're looking for the pattern, the fingerprint aspect of it. So if you're trying to put something in and you don't know what it is, you're at a serious disadvantage. The other advantage of magnetic resonance is it depends on a database. So you start getting an actual picture of what honey actually is, which is, as Gillian mentions, we don't have a good definition of it. So if you have a database of authentic honey, all of a sudden you have the ability to describe it that much better. It needs to look like this. And if it doesn't, something's wrong. And you see that with these resin filtered, you have all these portions of the honey that are basically non-existent. And it's really no longer honey. You're just ending up with another form of a syrup. So that's, to me, kind of what the big advantage of something like magnetic resonance is. You're looking at the entire composition because it's complicated. It's a complex mixture of unique components. The other advantage is that you can start getting away from this commoditization that has happened with honey. Honey is a lot more like wine, where you have the kind of flower it comes from is different, right? In wine, you have a specific grape, gives you a specific flavor, and that has not been emphasized in the marketing there. So that's what has allowed this fraud to really persist, because there's no distinction between the honey on the shelves. And you can move away from it. We also have the ability to look at the country of origin there, or geographic region more specifically. You are able to distinguish between coasts. I've certainly seen that with our own honey. We can tell the difference between blueberry honey that is produced on the West Coast versus blueberry honey on the East Coast of Canada. And all those things can be used as selling points as well, just as they are in the wine industry. And that is really what honey is. It's not just a sweetener. And this marketing as a sweetener has been a big disservice, because without that distinguishing ability there, it's just another sweetener. And honey can never compete on price to something like, basic white cane sugar. That's not where it should be. And we need to move away from that sort of commoditization that has happened, because it benefits these scammers and fraudsters that are bringing in these fake honeys.
What's your thoughts on that, Gillian? Do you think there's maybe a route there that looks promising to sort of emphasize the kind of premium nature of honey as a product over just being a sweetener, to differentiate it a bit?
Well, sure, if there wasn't the fraud going on that we've got going on. What we've got is, as Peter just pointed out, we've got all sorts of honey on the market, and it's all labeled honey, and it's not honey. So yeah, that would be good. There are some products that I have seen that it actually says honey syrup, and I've actually bought it before and not realized that that's what I purchased. And then I was really upset, like, oh, wait a minute, this isn't even honey. But as it turns out, I think everything in my cabinet isn't honey. It's all honey syrup. It's all fake. We don't have real honey. I think some stores carry it. It's tremendously more expensive. I have seen it at some of our specialty markets, and I bought it, or like at a farmer's market, but it's more like $10, $15 for that real honey. But I'm not even sure. I know a lot of times, because, for example, a small local farmer beekeeper that's selling to local farmers markets, I have spoken to some of these people, and what they'll tell me is they don't have enough bees. They're not producing as much honey as they can actually sell at the farmer's market. So they will, for example, go to Costco and buy the big tub, 60 pounds of honey that they can get, and they'll take that. It's cheap. That's not real honey either. And they're mixing that with the honey that they've made unknowingly, now putting basically sugar syrup into their honey. So I don't know that at this point in time, the way the market is so flooded with the fake honey, and we've got bees that are dying, we've got colony collapse, we've got beekeepers who are looking to other methods of ways to survive, which does not involve producing honey, that there's just less and less real honey coming into the market. And I don't know how to stop it. I wish that in our testing, was the standard. But Peter, haven't you experienced a lot of pushback from the industry group saying, well, we don't need to use that. That's too expensive. We don't want to use it, because they don't want to be detected.
That is definitely the problem. They are seeing that it actually works, that this technique works, and it has the advantage that it gets better as the database gets better. That the more data we get and the more samples that we put in there, the better it's going to be. And you can take this same technique where we're looking at a database and identifying what honey really is, and you can start using it with other sorts of machines. And mass specs are becoming much, much more used. And you put mass spec together with a magnetic resonance machine, and you cover basically everything that is in the honey. And those two machines together will be pretty much impenetrable. So the industry is going to push back because they're seeing that. There is already evidence. They're going to people that are using the NMR, and they're sending samples, sort of a series where they've taken one honey and they've mixed in a little bit of syrup and more, and they're trying to figure out how can we get past this. And they're finding that it is not that easy. You know, in a lot of ways, a lot of the testing companies are in a bind because the people that are supporting them are the ones that are trying to get the fake honey on the shelves. They want to. We've seen this. There's sort of the one kind of standard test, the AOAC 988-112, which has been sort of enshrined in law across the world, and it's considered the standard test, and it doesn't work. It only detects the C4 syrups that are basically corn syrup is all that it'll detect. And there's been this massive switch away from corn syrup as a result, because rice syrup is readily available. It's undetectable by this method, and it's actually cheaper than corn syrup now. So they don't mind this test being used. And then they can point to the fact that the countries have put this in law as the official test and say, hey, my stuff passed. And it's good. And that was seen very clearly when there was the big news outbreak in Australia, where the company that was accused of being bringing in fraudulent honey in that was saying, look, we passed the tests, we're fine, and we're okay. And that's kind of one of these things that when you're doing the prosecution that you're facing, the company can kind of discredit. Oh, I did my best, and I did my due diligence. How can you accuse me? It's not my fault. And despite the fact that they know perfectly well when the honey that they're buying is a third the price of what they'd have to pay if it were locally produced.
Exactly. And I think that we need to hold the retailers accountable, because the beekeepers can't do anything. They don't have the power, and they don't have any money, and they are losing money. So the beekeepers, they have no choice. And in fact, I have heard from them directly that when they speak up, when they try to do something, then they get retaliated against. Then the packers that are controlling the market, they just won't deal with them. They won't buy their honey. They just go to someone else. And so that makes the problem even worse. And they are afraid. They are afraid to do anything because they have even less of a chance of survival if they get blackballed and no one will buy their honey. There are other packing companies that aren't doing this, but they're very small, and they also can't compete. They pay more for their honey because they're using real honey, and they have to then in turn sell it to the retailers for more. And the retailers, why are they going to pay more when they could pay half? And I think the retailers need to be held accountable. For them to turn a blind eye or for anyone to say they don't know is false. They know, and they just don't care. And we are seeing more and more, certainly in the United States, these retail chains saying they're going to be testing their own products for safety. They care so much about what's going on, and they start banning products. For example, It was just recently in the news that Costco stopped carrying a line of coconut milk and coconut water products because of a PETA investigation about monkeys being used as slave labor to acquire the coconuts. If we are not carrying a product because of monkey slave labor, why is Costco carrying products like fake honey that is going to destroy our food supply worldwide? It will, if all of the bees die and the beekeepers all go out of business, we literally aren't going to have anything to eat. And then we're all going to die. So this problem needs to be addressed. And I think that if it continues to be sold, consumers are going to buy it. People don't know about this problem. And the light at the end of the tunnel is that it is finally getting some mainstream press. Finally. And I think that is going to be the start of taking these bad actors down. The consumer needs to be made aware and to start holding the retailers accountable and not buying it. That will solve the problem, but that's going to take a Herculean effort, and it's not going to be easy to overcome.
Yes, it definitely, we're seeing those sorts of things. And a few of the minor efforts that have occurred, certainly in Canada, have actually produced results. What happened was that there was one of these online petitions went out objecting to the fact that they were using imported honey in their products. And that got a lot of news coverage, and it did make waves. And they felt it in their bottom line there, that it definitely affected. But they're still on the shelves, and they're still doing some of this. It didn't affect their whole line, but it made a difference. And I think that is really the only way that we're going to get any sort of action here. People feel it in their pocketbook there at that level. And that real pressure in the end comes from the people that are going and buying the honey. And they have to make it clear that they're not going to accept that. But along those lines, we need to have the labeling correctly. Honey does sell things. You see so much where it is, like Gillian was saying, she's buying this thing. It says honey on it, and she goes home and she sees it's actually honey syrup. But it's more than that. There's the things like your honey mustard sauce. Go and look at the ingredients on that. You'll see that the top thing in there is some sort of glucose fructose syrup, and honey is, fourth, fifth down on the line. They're using the label honey to sell products, but that's not what they're selling. They're putting in a token amount, and chances are that token amount there is the cheapest stuff that they could find on the market, and probably is actually just more glucose fructose syrup, and doesn't do anything for a beekeeper anywhere.
And I think that's another real problem that is really difficult to address. Like you said, they're using the cheapest ingredient they can find, labeling the product as made with honey, because that's what consumers want and they know it. And they are not putting real honey in the product. And probably if you talk to some of the food manufacturers, they'll say they're the victim, but it's hard for me to fathom that they don't know. And of course, they want to use the cheapest thing possible. Not all food companies, but it's a real problem. And that's even more difficult to address from a consumer standpoint, because then you're saying, I bought this cereal that has honey in it, sweetened with real honey, it says on the front. Well, then you've got to prove that it wasn't sweetened with real honey. Good luck. And then you've got to show what your damage is because of that. So on a $3 box of cereal, you still got cereal. It wasn't made with real honey. It was made with fake honey. Good luck. What's your damage? Maybe 4 cents a box. That's a really tough case, but it's actions like that are perpetuating the problem, because now you've got lies upon lies, and consumers really do care what they're buying and what they're eating and putting in their bodies. And I think some of the food manufacturers care what they're buying, but if they're not regulating it and making sure that they're buying real honey, then it just complicates and exacerbates the problem.
For sure. When you're buying product and you look at, here's the stuff that is from down the street, from the beekeeper there, and it's at this price, and then I can get this other stuff that is less than half, I don't think any reasonable buyer, especially for a company, is not going to go that there has to be some serious discrepancy here. Why can that stuff be so much cheaper? So it's not realistic to expect that these people don't know that there are things that are going on. But I think that's sort of one of the reasons, or one of the advantages of something like magnetic resonance. Here now, we have a tool that is basically a quality assurance tool. You're able to look at the entire thing. Magnetic resonance, the best known case of it is MRIs in hospital. And that's probably the way to think of what we're doing here, is that we're imaging the honey. We get the whole picture of it, and we can use that, and we can say, you can look at those pictures of the honey and say, hey, this is what it's supposed to look like. Why is it looking like this stuff here that is just not resembling proper honey and what it should look like?
Yeah, I think maybe the solution is we start a petition to get a magnetic resonance system and a mass spec in the back room of every Costco. Yeah, I think the consumer angle is definitely, that's got to be where the influence has got to come from, right? For any major change. Like, even if there are cases where maybe there isn't enough of a financial reward to make it a viable class action suit, people are still going to feel like they've lost out, to feel like they've been lied to. And, you know, if you find ways to use what legal suits you can bring, sort of raise the consumer awareness of this, then hopefully that can sort of start to spark more of a backlash. And as you said, I think that's already starting to happen.
Right. And one thing that is available under some of the state statutes, including California, as a remedy, and this seems like the type of case where it would be helpful, is setting aside the damages portion of it and the financial portion as we see it, is we do have a way we can seek injunctive relief, which would be to force proper labeling. And that may make a difference. You have to make the same showing on liability to get that remedy. But and it can be tricky to get it, but if we can prove that what is in those bottles consistently is not honey, then one of the remedies we can seek is to force proper labeling. And if we can force proper labeling, then consumers will be able to see this product is honey and this one is not. I don't know what they're going to call it. Honey syrup, maybe
style syrup or something.
Yeah, I got all sorts of ideas. But if we can force proper labeling on the products, which really traditionally you would think would be the function of FDA, but it just doesn't work in this context, then that will help. And so I think from that standpoint, there may not be as much incentive for plaintiffs' attorneys to seek out these cases because the financial piece is small, and we still got to pay for the litigation. And that's a reality that has to be balanced here, is that these aren't big damages cases. These are injunctive relief cases that have real meaning, but you've got to be willing to put in the resources to get that change. And you need a well-funded operation to get that. And that can be a challenge.
Yeah, for sure. But I think that's a sort of hopeful route, because there are other product areas where that happens, right? Where there's a clear sort of imitation product, sort of a lower tier in the market, but it's labeled clearly and people kind of know. The one that occurred to me was like maple syrup, where there's still fraud and there's still people trying to pass off any old syrup as maple syrup, but there's a much better labeling in the products. And there's much better consumer awareness of when you're getting actual real maple syrup and when you're getting just, generic breakfast style syrup or whatever it's labeled. It seems to be less of an insidious issue. That when there is a cheaper imitation product, it's sort of clearer and it stands out. And if you're not paying over $10 for it, then that's not maple syrup. And the same thing with certain other products. There's certain wines, as you mentioned, Peter, trying to sell honey more like wine is sold. Again, it's not like there's no fraud. We actually have an episode coming up about using magnetic resonance to combat wine fraud as well, of passing off cheaper wine as more expensive varieties. So it still happens there. but the consumer awareness at least is better in those areas.
I would say the same is true of olive oil also.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to, differentiate between real olive oil and fake olive oil, but I know it's a problem. So I trend toward the most expensive one on the shelf because I figure that one's probably real, but there is at least an awareness because of all the lawsuits that were filed.
Yeah, exactly. There's an awareness, and there is the tendency is towards clearer labeling as well. The ones that are real olive oil, you have the classifications like extra virgin olive oil and all those sorts of things where like there are certain standards that have to be met to put those labels on. So it's not like the fraud problem disappears, but it at least is a bit more out in the open, and hopefully consumers are a bit more aware of it, and consumers who do want the premium product know that they have to pay a little more for it, and they can kind of trust when they are getting that.
And that definitely is the advantage of magnetic resonance as a testing method. It is the kind of machine that you can apply to a whole series of foods, or even things like supplements and all these sorts of areas that are really not well looked at. Because again, in the same way that you look at the entire spectrum of compounds that are in honey, you can look at the entire spectrum that is in wine or in olive oil too. You can see that, and you can do the same sorts of comparing the database from one to against and doing these matching where you can identify where it came from, how it was produced, and all those things. Those compounds are in there, and when they're missing, something is going on that's different. So, it kind of goes back to you. If you're, having every Costco has one in the back room, they could be testing everything that's going through their stores and really improving our whole food system.
Yeah, great. Okay, just to kind of close off then, can I get each of you to kind of talk a little bit about sort of, we've talked about how this problem's developed over the sort of last 10 years. What do you hope for the next couple of years? What do you see coming up that you hope might happen that might give us some kind of glimmers of light at the end of this tunnel?
Well, I would hope that this issue gets more attention and that consumers are made more aware. And I think we're on that path. More press, more lawsuits filed, and I think more pressure on the retailers. That is my goal, because I think that that's the problem. If Walmart won't sell the product, for example, and I'm not singling out Walmart for any particular reason, I'm just, Walmart's one of the biggest retailers in our country. If Walmart won't put it on the shelf, then, people won't buy it. So that's, I think, at the end of the day, that's where it lies. I think if it's not in our stores, then people won't buy it. If they hold the packers really, or the people selling them the honey to a higher standard because there is public pressure to do so, then the problem will stop. So that's my hope. The consumer will be demanding a real product and proper labeling, and that will result in putting an end to this.
And yeah, we should emphasize we're not promoting or attacking specifically Walmart or Costco. Other retailers are available.
Yes.
How about you, Peter?
Well, I would have to agree with Gillian here that in the end, the only pressure that is going to be effective is from the consumers. But it definitely is going to have to be backed up with some ways of actually identifying where the problems are. And I don't see any way of doing that without technologies like magnetic resonance, where you can actually tell what you're looking at. Because how is the consumer going to know that? They don't have the ability to test what's on the shelf. Certainly there's things like the taste, but in the end, they're pretty much at the mercy of what's put up there. So without these technologies here to back us up and make sure, and I think pretty much everything should undergo some sort of testing, either at the ports when they come in, but also inside the country as well, because it's possible where things can happen there too. You can quite legally bring in some of these syrups into the country and then have the mixing and fraud going on inside. And it has to happen there sort of all along the chain.
Great. Okay, yeah, I think that's relatively positive, or at least hopeful note to leave it on. So thank you both for your time. Thanks for your input.
Likewise.
Good talking to you.
Thanks again to Gillian Wade and Peter Awram there for sharing their stories and their insights. In the next episode, we're going to be shifting gears a bit and focusing on wine rather than honey. Our guest will be Gordon Burns from ETS Laboratories in California, and he has quite a different story to tell about ensuring authenticity in the North American wine industry. Do make sure you check it out.